About 200 cardinals out of the college's 226 participated in an extraordinary consistory in Rome this week, the largest meeting of the College of Cardinals in Francis's 10-year pontificate. The last gathering, close to this size, was at the Synod on the Family in 2015. The closed-door meetings were convened by Pope Francis to reflect on his apostolic constitution called Preach the Gospel, the document on the reform of the Roman Curia. Joining me now from Rome with the latest on this consistory is editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, member of the Papal Posse, Robert Royal. Thanks for staying up for us. Bob, what are you hearing about the discussions during these 2 days of meeting, and does it have any form at all, this consistory?
Well, I have to say that it's rather disappointing to look at what actually happened. There wasn't a great deal of news. The 2 days that the cardinals met with the Holy Father in these private discussions, 3/4 of that time was spent discussing this kind of bureaucratic shuffle, the changes about the Curia in the new document that the Holy Father put out, Predicate Evangelium. And a lot of the debate about that was who can actually serve as the head of a Vatican dicastery. Can it be a layman? Can it be a lay woman? Can they have authority over a bishop? These are not trivial questions, and there are serious and far-reaching theological consequences of them. But in the current situation of the church and the current situation in the world, I don't think these are the most burning issues. The other thing that was scheduled to be talked about was the Jubilee year in 2025. So what's going to happen over the next 3 years? Strangely, even some of the quite sympathetic outlets to the Holy Father just said, there was some praise for the Vatican financial reforms. There was some discussion about some other things. And strangely, I think one of the odd things that came out of this consistory is that many of the cardinals still want to know. We've been in this process now for, a year and a half. They want to know what synodality is. Because next October, just a little over a year from now, the actual synod on synodality is going to take place in 2023. So here we have 200 of the church's top leaders who a year and a half into the synodal process don't even know what synodality is. So for me, that was one of the strangest things to come out of the past couple of years.
Some of them even challenged the idea. I noticed there were some historians there among the cardinals who said, wait a minute, where did this come from? There's no real historical precedent for this. What was the mood in Rome surrounding this extraordinary synod, Bob?
Well, I think that there were some expectations that there were rumors that when the Holy Father went to L'Aquila, there might be a resignation because L'Aquila has the tomb of Celestine V, who was the previous pope, the only previous pope prior to Benedict XVI who had actually resigned. And obviously the Holy Father's health is slipping a bit. And there were rumors about why was he going there in the midst of, all the cardinals being here. But I think overall, the cardinals that I've spoken with since the synod came to an end kind of feel that it fizzled out. There's always talk that these synods give a chance for the cardinals to get to know one another. And obviously, as you get near the end of a papacy, you want them to know one another well enough to at least begin to think about who might succeed to the papacy. But I'm a little skeptical of this. I mean, there was just the one day on Saturday when the cardinals were actually the new cardinals were made cardinals. Then the Pope went off to L'Aquila on Sunday. And then these 2 days of what were really, I think, rather abstract and not very incisive conversations. So how much they got to know each other, I really couldn't say that there was a great deal that was done in these days, but maybe some acquaintances are struck up and maybe some things will follow out of it. But I think overall, for me and for the people I've been meeting, it rather fizzled out.
In recent weeks, Bob, we have seen the church persecuted in Nicaragua, in recent months in Nigeria and China, of course. Any mention of those flashpoints, if you will, for the church at this meeting? Did they consider that at all, the state of the martyred church today?
Yeah, I didn't hear anything about it. In fact, I wrote, we have a spin-off from the Catholic thing called the Vatican thing. When I'm here in Rome, we're doing this Vatican thing. It's kind of a secondary column every day. And I wrote about this, that, when you think about the threats to the church around the world, the countries you just mentioned, as well as the pressures that we know are being put on Catholic institutions here in the United States. I hear that the same thing is happening in Europe, and they're just expecting that, the EU is going to kind of follow the kinds of things that the Biden administration has done by trying to force Catholic hospitals and schools and whatnot to follow the kind of woke culture that now has come about. There doesn't seem to have been any sense of urgency about any of that at all. Contrary to what the Holy Father has talked about in other contexts, it was very much inward looking on this, this sort of bureaucratic changes. What are we doing with synodality? What are we doing with the Jubilee year that's going to come up in 2025? Meanwhile, there are these sharp challenges to the church all around the world, the developed world as well as the developing world. And that seemed to be nowhere, anywhere in the discussion.
Bob, Cardinal Walter Brandmüller, a well-known traditionalist, one of the dubia cardinals, made an interesting request during this extraordinary synod that leaked out. And that was that the right to vote in a papal conclave be restricted. According to Brandmüller, serious reflection should be given to the idea of limiting the right to vote in conclave, for example, to cardinals residing in Rome, while the others, still cardinals, could share the status of cardinals over 80, meaning they can't vote. Now, Bob, Cardinal Brandmüller's concern is that non-curial cardinals from the peripheries, if you will, lack the experience of running the church, the challenges entailed, and don't know each other well, and might be more susceptible to lobbies pushing particular candidates for election. Your thoughts? Does the idea have any support?
Well, I suppose you could argue that. I have to say I was very surprised when he said that, because that means that it's going to be Vatican insiders who are going to be choosing the next leader of the worldwide Catholic Church. And maybe there's some strengths in knowing, bureaucratically how to operate. But it seems to me that, look, the Holy Father has actually appointed two different types of cardinals. I think we've talked about this before. Obviously, Cardinal McElroy from San Diego is very much in the line of Pope Francis. He's concerned about the environment. He's concerned about being welcoming immigrants, all that sort of thing. My own reading is that the cardinals from the peripheries tend to be much more traditional. And we know that in recent synods, that the Africans, for example, have been very strong in resisting any attempt to weaken church teaching on homosexuality. Not the reception or the inclusion of sincere homosexuals who are trying to live the Catholic life in parishes and whatnot, but resisting that ideological takeover. So I'm a little bit ambivalent about this. It seems to me that it's a good idea to have cardinals from outside the usual suspects. It seems to me to be good to have even some of these cardinals from the peripheries. They may not know the bureaucratic running of the church, but they are deeply committed to a more traditional Catholicism. I think their voices need to be heard in choosing whoever is going to be the successor to Pope Francis.
Now, this extraordinary consistory was preceded by the installation of 20 new cardinals, as we mentioned earlier. And as the Pope has done in the past, he elevated several men from these peripheries you mentioned: Brazil, Mongolia, India, Nigeria, Paraguay, and East Timor were represented. There was the one cardinal from the U.S., San Diego Cardinal Bishop Robert McElroy. What do these new cardinals tell us about the mind of Francis, and where do you think he's guiding the church here? Or where does he intend the church to go? Better asked, Bob.
Well, it's clear that there is this ideological element that we just talked about. And I think Cardinal McElroy, you would expect that Archbishop Jose Gomez from Los Angeles would have received a red hat. He did not. Perhaps Corleone from San Francisco. These are traditional sees in the United States that are large cities. McElroy was an auxiliary in San Francisco and was a bit of a problem for them. They didn't really know what to do with him, and then they decided to send him to San Diego. So it's clear that he's reached in instances like that and tried to bring along leadership. And some of the Latin American cardinals are like this as well, people who are kind of in his line. But there is this oddity, and I think it is an oddity. We know that he's talked about the peripheries and going out to the peripheries, but there is this oddity that these small places like Tonga, one of the youngest cardinals is from Tonga, which is a little island down near New Zealand, or he meets with an Italian missionary who's working in Mongolia, and the next couple of days he announced that he's going to be one of the cardinals. So I don't know exactly what he's doing with that, except that in my experience, and we covered the conclave that elected Pope Francis. He isn't a consistent thinker. I think there are many parts of his personality that don't always seem to be congruent with one another or concordant with one another. And so there really are two elements that are going on. There's that kind of more first world progressive element in his thinking about the future of the church. But then there's also this global, but not in an international globalist sense, but a kind of a attempt to bring in some other voices. So I don't know where this will go, and I'm not sure he does either.
Well, this is a graphic. He's now appointed 63% of the consistory here, the College of Cardinals, and you see the breakdown there: 29% appointed by Benedict, 8% by John Paul II at this point. So I mean, we begin to see an image or a vision of where he's trying to reshape the church, at least as an image. But I want to burrow down a bit. San Diego Cardinal Robert McElroy, now Cardinal, told the National Catholic Register regarding what he hopes to see in a future Pope, Bob. He said, "I would hope the trajectories of the renewal Pope Francis has begun would be a high priority in seeking the next Pope. I hope that would be many years down the road, but it'll still be important to try to bring those currents more fully into the life of the Church at all levels." Bob, will the next Pope be like Francis, especially given that Francis has chosen to elevate so many of these people from far away? Or, as you mentioned earlier, might the more traditional cardinals from places he didn't expect bedevil these plans for a carbon copy successor?
Well, one of the things we know is, there's even some Roman sayings about people who enter the conclave as papabili, as potential popes, come out cardinals. You never. And look, we know that the conclave that elected Pope Francis was largely the creation of Popes John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, and you would have expected the kind of the line that they had continued along for 35 or so years would have been expressed in Francis, but it didn't happen. I want to say about Cardinal McElroy, he has been really one of the cardinals who've kind of pushed the line of Pope Francis to our bishops. Our bishops have not been very welcoming of it. There was an exchange between him and then Archbishop Shepp, who is now retired, in 2019, in which McElroy was very strong about not considering abortion the preeminent moral issue in the United States. In other words, the kind of cardinal he would like to see, and the kind of pope probably he would like to see, is someone who wouldn't challenge a Nancy Pelosi, who now tells us that it's a sin to deny people access to abortion. They wouldn't challenge Joe Biden seriously. We basically would get the kind of business as usual that we have in places like the United States and unfortunately in Europe as well. So there's great uncertainty, I think, about where the church will go after Francis, and perhaps that's a good thing. I don't think we can predict in advance, although I've heard in the last couple of days rumblings that there's a kind of a new St. Gallen mafia that's trying to already begin to shape the next conclave, and who knows what that will result in.
Well, we'll stay tuned for that. But Cardinal Arthur Roche of the UK, who was given the red hat by Pope Francis this weekend and serves as prefect of the Dicastery for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, he warned about the politicization of debates over the different forms of the Mass, Bob. He told Crux, those who argue that the reforms of Pope Paul VI and Pope Francis are contrary to church tradition, quote, "We've got to be very careful because the church passes on the tradition, and it's the church that makes the tradition. It's not people in lobbies that create the tradition." Now, Bob, I thought tradition proceeded apace. I didn't realize it skipped two papacies, 35 years you just ignore. Roche went on to say, quote, "I always think that for me as an Englishman, a great example to me is our history, our Reformation history, where our young priests were tortured and very cruelly executed for two things, for the Mass and in faithfulness to the See of Peter. in faithfulness to the Pope. Whenever we celebrate Mass, we always mention at the point of unity, first, that we're in union with the Pope, and second, that we're in union with the bishop, who is in union with the Pope. I thought Jesus was the first point of unity, and just to give him a tiny little refresher course in Reformation history, they were fighting over an marriage annulment. Let's not forget. It was the marriage that was the centerpiece and doctrine they were defending, and most of the bishops folded. Your thoughts, Bob, as you hear all of that?
Well, it was Benedict XVI, back when he was just a theologian, Joseph Ratzinger, who said that the change in the liturgy that Paul VI introduced, the radical change that he introduced in the 1960s, had never happened before in the history of the church. So when you talk about, being loyal to the tradition and loyal to the church, the loyalty, as Chesterton says, has to be also about the democracy of the dead. That you talk about inventing something. We invented something in the 1960s that isn't particularly gainly, that doesn't draw people in with a depth of spirituality that the older liturgy displayed. That was radical in its departure, and it's sort of brusque departure from what we had earlier. And so I think for all these reasons, and we go back to that document of Vatican II about the liturgy that talks about the Latin language and Gregorian chant. We've talked about that a million times already. So, the idea that somehow people who are looking back and saying, well, wait a minute, 60 years ago, suddenly we come up with this entirely new thing, and that to go back to what we had then is regarded as somehow schismatic, or it's been banned from our use. I mean, that's another thing that Ratzinger said, that how can you take something that was holy and was the expression of our unity with the Lord in the Eucharist and just say that form of it is can no longer be used? So there's something very odd about the way I think that now Cardinal Roche approaches this. Clearly, he's expressing what Francis wants, although he's been so absolute about it that we hear some rumors that the Pope actually has been a little bit annoyed with him, that the Pope himself begins to be criticized because people think that he is behind the harsher steps that Roche has been taking. But this is very odd. I don't think that this attempt to tamp down the traditional Latin language is going to work. I think we're going to see some interesting changes in the future.
The actor Shia LaBeouf was recently interviewed about his conversion to Catholicism. He plays Padre Pio in a new film. He claims the traditional Latin Mass, Bob, played a role in his conversion. Listen.
Latin Mass affects me deeply. And,
How come?
Because it feels like they're not selling me a car. And when I go to some Mass with the guitars and stuff, and I'm from, Santa Ynez, right? So that's where I was catechized. And there's a lot of guitar playing. And there's a lot of what feels like they're trying to sell me on an idea. Christ the King in Oakland does a Latin Mass every day of the week. And it feels like it's not being done to sell me on anything. And it feels almost like I'm being let in on something very special. And the quiet, it activates something in me where it feels like I found something.
That's Shia LaBeouf with Bishop Barron. He is not unlike many young people I've encountered, Bob, who are drawn to the mystery, to the wonder of the traditional Latin Mass, the otherness of it. Why is the Vatican so insistent on stamping this out? Surely this had to come up at some point during this consistory.
I didn't hear it. I talked with a lot of people, and that doesn't seem to have been there was a lot of silence from what I'm told during this point of the various discussions in the consistory. You would have expected that maybe that would have come up because it was not the case that the bishops of the world or the cardinals of the world were demanding the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass. But look, the reason why that mystery is so attractive to people is because the reforms of the Mass that we got are on a very superficial level. On the one hand, you do want to have a liturgy, and you do want to have a church that speaks to people today. But what today is a very kind of practical, horizontal level society where we don't even have a very deep sense of nature, let alone of what's supernature, what's supernatural.
Right.
You take those elements from society, like guitar playing and whatnot, that, look, there's a place for guitar music. You love certain guitar music, so do I. Anybody who loves music will like various different types of music. But certain forms lend themselves more readily to the kinds of spaces, spiritual spaces, that are not just the emotional, what's normally emotional in the society and in the time that we're living in right now. And I think that what LeBoeuf was responding to there is something that really transcends every particular time, and that takes you back over thousands of years. I mean, this is something that is based, the way we read from scripture is based in the ancient Hebrew way of conducting their liturgies. And so we're really, we're digging back into a very rich human thing as well as a Catholic thing. So it's not surprising. It's not surprising that what is regarded as mystery really just conveys something that you cannot, by some sort of rational reform, hope to achieve in the modern world.
No, it's the past and the present and the supernatural all meeting in that one moment. I mean, it is Christ crucified and our moment and the future. It's everything, and that the Novus Ordo strains to capture that sense of awe, and it can do it. But it's a rarity because the form is so broken and do-it-yourself, if you will. Now, Cardinal Roche spoke in glowing terms, Bob, about, quote, the inculturation of the Roman Missal into the Amazonian culture. How about the inculturation of the Roman Missal to the traditional Roman rite? I mean, again, we're justifying odd permutations of the Mass, but then trying to blow away and destroy everything that the current Mass sits upon.
Yeah, and I see in this a deep problem with our Western civilization in general. We tend to look at other civilizations, whether it's indigenous peoples in the Amazon or people in Africa or Asian cultures, and think that somehow they're superior to us. And look, given the discussion we just had about the liturgy, there's a way in which those cultures do tend to touch on timeless ancestral truths and depth about nature and about supernature. But at the same time, it's odd that our own tradition is not hardly valued at all. We take this thing that was developed over the course of centuries and slowly was built up into a magnificent edifice, whether it's a full high Latin Mass or it's a low Mass. There were things that had been built into that you just simply cannot reproduce because you decide you're going to have a liturgical reform. And the results are clear. We know people used to go to those Masses, even if, we hear the story that they didn't understand. I remember my parents didn't know any Latin, but they took their missals and they had their Latin and English on Facebook pages, and they followed along and they knew what was going on. What we have now is very easy to understand, but is what we're understanding all that important to us? I mean, we just don't seem to be, those profound spiritual truths, those profound spiritual realities don't seem to be carried to the heart, as Cardinal Newman once said, when we're experiencing them in the liturgies.
The universality is also blown, Bob, when you don't have a common language, in Paris, in Madrid, and in the United States. There was at one time, we had a common language, and that Latin was everywhere. It was foreign to everyone. Yet it was home, and it was the home language of the Church for centuries and centuries. And to shatter that's a big trade-off. At a press conference in the Vatican last Friday, Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich of Luxembourg and Cardinal Mario Gresh of Malta introduced the continental phase of the Synod on synodality. When asked about whether the voices of Catholic priests and lay people who love the Latin Mass would be listened to in the process, Cardinal Gresh, who is Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops, said, quote, the listening process means not only for bishops to listen to the people, but also the bishop has to be listened to, because sometimes there's the risk of it being a monologue on one side or the other, end quote. And when asked if the cardinals were worried about political interests and how they might hijack the synod, Gretsch said, quote, "The synod will be hijacked by one, the Holy Spirit, if I can use this term." Bob, your thoughts on those responses, and what do you think we can expect here?
Raymond, you're giving me some very hard questions, and it's almost 1 a.m. here in Rome. Look, this process, I mentioned earlier in this segment that we had bishops in the actual extraordinary synod asking what synodality is at this point, and
right.
we're into this continental phase, and these men who've been living decades in the church don't know what we're talking about. The very process of this is just so bureaucratic. God love the people who participated in this at the parish level and the diocesan level, and then, these reports get pushed up the food chain, and now we're going to have the continental level, and then, someone is going to have to sort all this stuff out, and maybe cherry picking is too strong a word, but you cannot take the input of 100,000 people and condense it into something that is going to be representative, and especially if among those 100,000, some of the most, let's say, radically motivated, we see this in Germany, the most radically motivated people seem to show up and stay the longest at these types of meetings. So, look, the process, I don't think you can blame the Holy Spirit about whatever is going to come out of the process. This is very much a bureaucratic process that is going to lead, I fear, to where it has already been predetermined it's going to go to. Maybe I'll be wrong. The Holy Spirit is a spirit of surprises, as the Pope always tells us. But if you have to just judge by sort of human standards, it's pretty clear that there's going to be a heavy human intervention in what is considered worthy of being discussed.
Yeah, well, we can decide and discern which spirit showed up when it's over, not at this far away date. But on Sunday, Pope Francis became the first pope in 728 years to open the Holy Door at the Basilica in the Italian city of L'Aquila, which you mentioned earlier. The opening of the Holy Door marking a key moment in the annual celebration established by Pope Celestine V in 1294. It's known as the Celestine Forgiveness. Now, Pope Francis visited the city's cathedral, which is still being rebuilt after it was badly damaged during a 2019 earthquake. More than 300 people sadly died in that earthquake. The Pope wore a hard hat while touring the damaged church. During his visit, the Pope said that he wanted the central Italian city to become a capital of forgiveness and peace and reconciliation. L'Aquila is also the burial place of Pope Celestine V, who led the Catholic Church for just 5 months before his resignation. Now, in the spring, the Vatican's announcement that Pope Francis would visit this town prompted speculation that the trip could be a prelude to the 85-year-old Pope's resignation. Bob, that sort of fizzled out. I mean, they didn't continue that narrative, though, boy, we heard months of breathless coverage that the Pope was about to retire, and you saw phalanxes of press people going over to try to cover this.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a mystery why he decided to do that in the midst of the ordinary synod making the cardinals on Saturday and then the extraordinary synod for the 2 days, Monday and Tuesday. But I have to say, I found it very moving. And actually, that part of Francis's papacy is really him at his best. It was very, you can probably still find the video on YouTube or someplace, but it's very moving. He had to be pushed up to the doors in a wheelchair to begin with. And then this very big, I think, a Swiss guard came and kind of helped him to his feet and got him close to the door. And then he knocked very loud with this olive wood stick, kind of almost a club on the door. And then when the doors were opened, he had to, he has a very bad knee problem, so he had to kind of inch his way across the threshold into it. But I found it to be very moving. And, given what L'Aquila has been through because of the earthquake and this long history that it had, that for me, when I actually witnessed it, I thought was more important than, the rumors about the resignation. The Pope's health is clearly declining. He's 85, I suppose, now. Yeah, he's he won't be around forever. But I think this part of his legacy is really the best of him. He does have that charismatic ability to reach out to people and to talk about forgiveness. That is quite rare. Other popes have talked about it. John Paul II did encyclicals about mercy, so did Benedict, and so have other popes in the tradition. But I think this is the better part of Francis, quite apart from the speculation about his resignation. But he's he's getting near the end, and we're going to just have to see how this plays itself out.
Bob, before we go, I want to get your reaction to this. An advisory panel of theological consultants has recommended that the cause of canonization for Father Vincent Capodanno be suspended. Now, Father Capodanno was a priest, chaplain. He served courageously as a Marine during the Vietnam War. The panel wrote this: with ongoing military actions in the world today, raising someone from the military for veneration may not be appropriate for our church. Bob, your thoughts, and do they realize how faithful Catholics in the military interpret and read and feel about this kind of statement?
Yeah, the Father Capodanno case is sort of a classic. We remember from World War II and earlier wars that, the priest who would go out on the battlefield and be killed, sometimes, administering the last rites to soldiers, is regarded as a hero. Several countries have always thought of that as one of the most heroic things that a man of the cloth could do. I fear this goes back to what I might almost describe as Francis's sentimental pacifism. I mean, he has called for, a revaluation of just war theory. Just last week at his Wednesday audience, he talked about how everybody involved in a war is mad, meaning crazy. That you can't say you're not mad if you're involved in a war. Well, they had to back off on this. You notice there was a statement after the fact that he wasn't making a political statement that both sides in Ukraine were equally to blame. But it's the kind of almost default setting that he has when he thinks about warfare, that somehow that war in and of itself is wrong. Look, war is terrible. Anybody who's ever served in the military will tell you it's a terrible thing, even though they're proud of their service. But there's a difference between a priest who dies on the battlefield or a soldier who dies defending a country that has been the victim of an unjust aggression, and just the wildness of some invader. I mean, these are basic, classic distinctions in Catholic moral thought, Catholic thinking about just war theory that goes at least all the way back to St. Augustine and probably further. So, it just seems to me that this is one of these places where there's a certain sentimentality that has gotten hold over and above what is clear thinking about, unfortunately, what happens when evil people in the world do evil things. They have to be responded to. Otherwise, we're just going to surrender to people who just think they can do whatever they want.
Yeah, well, I think for men and women in the armed services, having a clergyman there, having a priest among them, particularly when they go into the warfield, this is a boon for them spiritually and otherwise. And you think of Father Duffy and my friend Archbishop Philip Hannon, who served in the First and Second World War. I mean, these were incredible men, and the men who served with them have such deep, passionate memories, and they help them maintain their sanity in the chaos of war. And I think to discredit that and the possibility of sainthood in a uniform is really disgraceful. I'll just say it. It's disgraceful. A funeral mass for the...
Back. I mean,
go ahead.
I think we can hope that Father Capodanno will come back and receive his proper honors at some point.
Yeah, and Archbishop Arroyo has said, who's the head of the military archdiocese, he is going to continue to pursue the cause, and it should be continued. A funeral mass was said this week, Bob, for former Archbishop of Milwaukee, Rembert Weekland. He died last week at the age of 95. It was held Tuesday at the Cathedral of St. John the Evangelist. The Mass came with controversy as survivors of clergy abuse demonstrated outside the church. Now, during his time as Archbishop from 1977 to 2002, Weakland covered up abuse and knowingly transferred abusive clergy to new parishes. Survivors argued that a public funeral was a celebration of Weakland.
This man being buried Tuesday is unrepentant. He died unrepentant for the harm that he caused.
Weakland was also forced to resign, as you know, Bob, as Archbishop, after it became known that the Archdiocese paid out nearly $500,000 hush money to a man with whom Weakland had a sexual relationship. Your thoughts? Weakland was never forced to face any consequences, Bob, for the abuse he allowed to happen, nor for the money he misused from the diocese.
Yeah, and after the scandal came out, he wrote a book which basically tried to justify himself, making excuses that psychiatrists had told him it was okay to put these men back into service, and even kind of trying to smooth over his own sordid personal history. Look, I met him a couple of times back when the bishops were working on an economics document in Washington. He was a very kind of imposing figure. He had a very nice manner, and he had a way of speaking that just made you feel a certain respect for what he had to say. But I find that covered up something that was so painful. We kind of all detected that there was something fishy going on there, but when it actually came out, it really felt very, very sordid. And you saw that Father James Martin at first praised him as a friend who unfortunately went astray, but then, of course, had to back off when he saw that the pain that many of the victims of those priests actually felt and expressed when this was going on. So look, it's a mess. I think it would have been better if his funeral had been a quieter affair. There were many people who tried to justify, as he did, what he did, because the secular world has a very strong sympathy for so-called closeted Catholic clerics. But I think he overall was had a very bad effect on the United States. And it's an effect that has not gone away in any way, shape, or form. It still continues, and there are still people hurting from it. So we're going to have other cases like this, and I think the church has to be very cautious about how it handles them, just so it doesn't give the impression that, things happened in the past, but so what?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. This should have been done very quietly, if at all. It should have been done in the dead of night with no one watching, and certainly not a public celebration of any kind. I mean, we're going to have a mass for McCarrick, too, in a few years. Anyway, we will leave it there, Bob. I'll let you get some rest. Thank you for staying up for us in Rome. For more commentary, Robert Royal is always available at thecatholicthing.org. Read his pieces. It's important stuff. Thank you, Bob.